evening and welcome to Domination Submission Radio. My name is Mike Mackay. I'm your host with the most DS, BDSM, kink, and fetish talk on Blog Talk Radio. I also happen to be the author of just released book, Domination Submission, the BDSM Relationship Handbook. So take a look and find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. This is a call-in show. So let me give you the number that you can use to call in, give us your opinions, or ask your questions. The number is 347-857-1862. Again, 347-857-1862. We also have a chat room. If you're listening to us live on Blog Talk Radio, just scroll to the bottom of your screen and you should see the chat room right there. I do believe you have to be logged in at Blog Talk Radio in order to speak in the chat room. But it's a great way for you to ask your questions and make your opinions known without having to call in and suffer the embarrassment of hearing yourself on the radio. We'd also love it if you check out our website. The website is domination-submission.com. Domination-submission.com. There you'll see our links to Twitter and Facebook and other social media, as well as information about this show and my book. I have in studio with me my co-host, L.B. Shaw, who is the author of the Trust in Me series of erotic fiction and about to release a book called Becoming Stone. How you doing, L.B.?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm sorry. I forgot to turn your mic on.
I just turned it.
How's your week been?
It's been pretty good. Thanks.
Are you ready for this topic? We're talking tonight, by the way. Our topic is consent and consensual non-consent. Are you ready for this one?
I am. This is a subject I'm really interested in because probably about 3 or 4 months ago I had not even heard of it and had no idea what it was. And to be honest, made me a little uncomfortable. I think I blogged about it, but so yeah, I'm really, really excited to talk about this tonight.
Super. Our other co-host tonight is Lolita Sin, who happens to be a fetish model and a rope bunny. Are you there, Lolly?
I am indeed.
Got to figure out how to say this, Lolly.
Come on, you sang along with the song the other week, and you can't remember how to pronounce it?
I actually did.
Lolly, get your efforts in.
See, all I have to do is play that every once in a while, and I have no problem. So what do you think of this topic?
I'm very well versed in this topic. I've spent several years in consensual non-consent myself, actually. So I'm pretty excited to talk about it.
Super. Yeah, you are a big part of the master-slave subculture of the BDSM lifestyle, so I'm interested in getting your perspective on this. We also have a special guest tonight. Our guest is Betty, who happens to be a sex educator in Washington, D.C., a longtime member of the BDSM community, and she's joining us tonight to talk about these topics. How are you doing, Betty?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Now, you talk about this all the time, don't you?
I talk about this pretty much on a daily basis with people. We run into this pretty much on a daily basis as well, just with people not giving consent. So,
do you find that this is a topic that generates a lot of controversy or hard feelings or misunderstanding?
Yes. We find that, especially within BDSM, consensual non-consent is a very big gray area. It can really be frowned upon because things like rape play and just pushing limits where people may or may not be comfortable. No one wants to leave psychological irreparable damage to anyone. So that's the part that's really frowned upon. And sometimes people do their feelings hurt when not able to have what they feel that their needs are being met just because of safety or because they don't want to consent to something.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just outline for our listeners some of the hot-button topics, I think, that are included in this subject, some of the questions that we will try to address tonight as we discuss it. A lot of us have probably been aware of the recent activism on several fronts, trying to reverse what a lot of people see as a rape culture or a culture that condones rape or unconsensual violence against people, not just women, but anyone. And you see this when people are blaming the victim for their abuse or for their assaults, blaming them because of how they act or how they dress or whether they've been drinking or not and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to get everyone's definition of what consent really is here and what it isn't, because sometimes these things are more easily defined by looking at what it isn't, I guess. And then we're really going to talk a lot about this consensual non-consent subject. We're going to ask questions like, is it smart? Is it legal? Is it a viable defense if it goes horribly wrong for you? and probably the most important one to everyone listening tonight, and that is, what are the implications for people in the BDSM and fetish cultures? Because I think there's some really heavy implications there for those of us in the lifestyle. Do you think there are some questions we missed there, Betty?
No, I think those are wonderful questions. I think that's a lot of things that we cover daily about people saying, is this okay, is this legal? I think it's going to be a really amazing discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, let's start off with LB. You got a question for Betty?
Well, I don't have any questions as of yet. I guess one of the things that I struggle with is just in learning, since I'm kind of new to the whole scene, is understanding if safe words come into play and that sort of thing. So maybe you can shed some light on that, because my understanding is that safe words kind of get tossed out of the window.
I think consent is the definition of it is permission for something to happen. You have to give permission for something to happen. The other person has to receive that permission for something to happen. Consensual non-consent is what blurs the lines, and you fall into a big gray area, and it's a big area of trust because you're consenting for someone else to push your boundaries that you may or may not feel comfortable with, and ultimately it's frowned upon again because you're not sure if the other person really says, oh, do they mean that I should be stopping? They consented for me to push these limits. And then you do get into legal implications, which are completely different. Legal consent is a completely different topic.
You know, part of the problem with the relationship between safe words and consensual non-consent is that consensual non-consent almost depends entirely on the safe word concept. Without safe words, you really don't have any safety net there. The idea of a safe word is that I can say, you know, if I'm your bottom, I can say no, 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 and that doesn't mean no until I blurt out my safe word. And so the safe word, the whole idea of consensual non-consent depends on the safe word concept, because otherwise there's no limit to how wrong this can go. Theoretically, once I've given you my consensual non-consent as my top, that means you can push my limits, and even if I say no, 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 that doesn't really mean no until I give you my safe word. And that's, I think, the confusing thing for a lot of people. Do you agree, Betty?
I agree. And where people get stuck is when they say no and they think that means no, but in the confines of relationships and understanding and trust, your safe word is established so that this means the final stop. I definitely mean that this should end. And you're basically giving up that right. You have the right to say no, and you're giving that up when you're consenting to have the other person maintain consent for you. You're trusting that other person knows you well enough and is capable enough and is safe enough to not damage you psychologically, physically, or emotionally. And that's where things can go wrong, and you don't have a crystal ball, and you can cause damage.
I think one of the big questions, and I didn't put this out in my list of questions we wanted to address in the show, but the bottom line and the ultimate question that everyone's going to be asking, and hopefully will walk away from this show with an answer to, is, are there times where no means yes? And that is a very controversial question, particularly in today's politically correct environment where there are a lot of people out there who look down on the BDSM lifestyle and say, you know, that's why the lifestyle is abusive, because you encourage people to believe that there could be times, possibly, when no means yes. And that's a really hot button. We're going to address this and other topics when we get back from the break. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. Our guest tonight is Betty from Washington, D.C., a sex educator. My co-hosts are L.B. Shaw and Lolita Sin, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Kai. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio, and we're talking tonight about consent and consensual non-consent. And our guest tonight is Betty, a sex educator from Washington, D.C., and we are going to ask Lolly her definition of consent and non-consent, and then we'll kind of go to LB, and then I'll ask you, Betty, to tell us where we are either on the mark or off the mark. So you're first, Lolly. Tell us your definitions of consent. What is consent and what isn't consent?
Fair enough. Well, consent is pretty simple. It's permission. It is the difference between yes and no. There is no gray area there. When you give consent, you are giving permission to somebody to do X, Y, and Z, or maybe just X and Y. Maybe you don't consent to Z, but that's the point. You can consent. As far as consensual non-consent, it's pretty much a blanket permission, at least from what I'm familiar with. A lot of the consensual non-consent that I've come into proximity with generally doesn't have a safe word either, but again, that's just my experience with it.
Well, how about we save the consensual non-consent for a little bit later on? And let's get consent and not consenting defined first before we get into the pretzel logic of consensual non-consent. LB, what do you consider to be the definition of consent, and what isn't consent?
Consent is, just like Lolly said, giving your permission, or submissive giving permission to a dominant to do particular acts, or permission to do certain things within the confines of playtime or a relationship. And not giving consent would be not verbally giving that permission. I guess it can get a little gray if there's implied consent. And I'm not speaking in legal terms, but implied consent in that you don't use a safe word when certain things are happening, and you've discussed soft limits and hard limits.
Betty, is there anything wrong with those definitions?
No, I agree that it is permission for something to occur. It's permission for someone to have something occur.
Okay, now here's my problem with this. I have a marketing background, all right? I come from an advertising background, and we talk all the time about what we call weasel words in marketing, which is words that really don't mean anything. And I've heard everyone here tonight say, well, permission for something to happen or permission for it not to happen. Okay, here's an example. If you give me permission to give you an erotic spanking, does that give me permission to touch your genitalia? Yes or no?
No. You would have to negotiate that, and that negotiation is where the scene and the lifestyle of BDSM is different, and you lay out your boundaries and your limit, and you have to negotiate what you do and do not want out of that. And spanking would be limited to a certain area. It could not involve genitalia whatsoever, and that needs to be discussed beforehand, before even engaging. And it is up to the person also receiving the play, not just giving the play, to establish their own boundaries.
But you see where I'm going with this, right? I mean, different words mean different things to different people, and sometimes it can get very, very confusing, especially when people have not been in the lifestyle for a long time. They may not fully understand the implications of what something is called or what is involved in it. Lolly, you've done this you've been a rope bunny for a long time. Have you seen where these kind of misunderstandings have occurred?
Pretty much every single time, yes.
Last week about this, right?
Yeah, actually, about the wrestling scene that I had where, we didn't quite understand what actually the term safe word meant for each of us. But, I mean, it really comes down to, in my job, we use a term called, if you assume it makes an ass out of you and me, ass you me. Don't assume that your definition of a word is the same definition as somebody else's. It's the same thing you were saying earlier. You have to negotiate every little thing. You have to lay out in plain terms, what is an erotic spanking? Does that mean you're only going to be spanking, or because it's erotic, are you now including genitalia in that? You have to be very clear.
Mm-hmm. LB, you're fairly new to the lifestyle. Is this something that really bothers you or concerns you going into it, not really knowing if somebody understands where your limits to your consent really lie?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily concerned, but just in thinking about it, my overall feeling or thought is that a lot of the ethicalness of it probably lies in the hands of the dominant, and I would hope that someone wouldn't enter into either playing with or a relationship with someone that they didn't really trust and know well. But it can be concerning, especially if you're not really sure about what you're getting into and don't really understand what it means.
Betty, you talk about this all the time in your work. What is the source of the biggest misunderstanding when it comes to what is consent, what isn't consent, and how it affects people in this lifestyle?
A lot of times it's a multifaceted thing, really. People that are new to BDSM, they want to experience things and they want to learn things, and they don't know who to ask, or they don't have a mentor that they can trust or that's going to look out for their safety. Or they could say, oh, I want to consent to this, but they've been playing with someone who does hedge and toe the line of consent because their ethics aren't the same as what you may be used to or what you may want as a person. And then you find yourself in a scene with someone that is pushing lines and things like that you didn't really even know about. And a lot of times it does come down to a lack of communication, or just someone else in general on the street even, or you go on a date, not even in BDSM, and they have these needs and wants from you, and they don't even tell you what those needs and wants are. They just put you into this scenario. Even people that don't disclose that they're married, or they don't disclose that, they have children, the other person may not want any of that in their life, and they may not want to be involved in that, and suddenly you have this other person in your life that's involved in all of this scenario and this situation. It comes down to knowing what you want in general and always erring on the side of caution. It is up to the dominant person in a scene like that to always be ready to take responsibility for the person that they are topping. And that does mean legal, ethical, physical safety, emotional safety. And if the other person especially does not know what they want or is new, the dominant person in the scenario should take that responsibility, and they should be able to. And there are so many times, which is why we end up talking about this so much, that people blur those lines and they push those lines to meet their own wants, and that's selfish and dangerous.
Now, legally, a person cannot consent legally if they're under the influence of alcohol or they're under the influence of drugs. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see alcohol and drugs at most BDSM lifestyle gatherings and events, because obviously they just don't mix. Now, the question I have is, doesn't the effects, some types of BDSM play produce endorphins which almost make you high or drunk or put you in subspace or whatever, which also might make you incapable of actually giving true consent?
It does happen. It's a very common occurrence. We can also have our toppy feelings of the same endorphins, where we feel we're unstoppable and that we know everything and that we can handle any situation. And one has to always, again, err on the side of caution. And it's always safer to have someone, especially if you're new in the scene, who can stop a scene and say, look, I have to stop. This is looking uncomfortable. That's why when there are play parties, dungeon monitors who are trained to look out for these things are there to stop the scene. If it's looking like it's going to be unsafe, or if you happen to overhear a scene occurring and you hear the negotiation occurring, because there should always be negotiation. A dungeon monitor can easily stop something for you. It's different when you're in the confines of your own home or you're meeting new people and you're feeling those wonderful feelings. You may not be able to honestly give full consent, and that's why it's always better to write things down in black and white, have people sign it, and just, again, it is up to that dominant person to take responsibility for what does happen, because they are ultimately giving the action.
It's true. Lolly, are you required in your line of work as a fetish model, are you required to sign a lot of agreements to whatever's going to happen, or no?
Yeah, every shoot you do have to do a model release, but for the most part the releases more have to do with the content rather than what's going to happen in the video. There's always discussions of what's okay, what's not, and just kind of a rundown of what's going to be happening in the video. Kind of like a mini script, sort of, but not with paper.
LB, do you got any questions on what we've talked about so far?
I actually do have a question. It might be a little bit long, but I can ask it now, or I can ask later if you like.
Let's do it now.
Okay. So I'm thinking that one of the more common types of consensual non-consent activity is the whole abduction play and rape fantasy and that sort of thing. So my question is, if you work out this stuff ahead of time and your partner, or your dominant, knows all of your hard limits, and you discuss what you're willing to do, let's say, I'm willing to travel so far, I'm willing to let someone that I don't know abduct me, or I'm not willing to let someone, it has to be just the dominant. You can take me to a place I've never been. I only want it to happen for 2 hours, and I want you to respect all my hard limits within that. Is that still considered consensual non-consent if the dominant or the top decides when and where and the how of the rest of all of that occurs?
That is a super question, and we are going to get Betty's answer on that right after the break. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. I'm Mike Mackay. My co-hosts are L.B. Shaw and Lolita Sin, and our guest is Betty, a sex educator from Washington, D.C. And we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Back to Domination Submission Radio. We've been talking about consent and consensual non-consent, mostly consent and non-consent, but now we're going to talk about consensual non-consent. And if you think consent and non-consent can get complicated, wait till we talk about consensual non-consent. We really haven't defined this yet, and I'm going to take a stab at it, and y'all can tell me if I'm on the mark or not. Consensual non-consent is where you agree ahead of time to consent to stuff in the future, even if you say no in the future. In other words, you are authorizing your play partner to ignore your no's going forward. Does that working definition work for you, LB, especially in relation to the question that you asked before the break?
I guess my definition is just negotiations made ahead of time with the submissive and the dominant that the submissive agrees to relinquish ahead of time consent for certain activities or whatever for a certain period of time, whether that's temporary or permanent. So, but yes.
How about you, Lolly? Does that sound like a good definition to at least start with?
I don't think it quite captures entirely what consensual non-consent does, to be completely honest.
What do you say, Betty?
I say that it is permission as a blanket statement to be granted ahead of time overall, where it is irrevocable in most circumstances. Again, you have to be ready to accept what happens if something goes wrong. And as the top, generally that responsibility falls on you. And let's consider, we talked about rape play earlier, and this is what is brought up when you talk about consensual non-consent. Rape play is generally a very big gray area. It's kind of frowned upon at times in the BDSM community because anything can happen and anything can go wrong. How many times have we read in the news where you've got a couple and the dominant has kidnapped the submissive and they're having this rape play fantasy and they're driving around and the cops pull them over? You can't plan for that, but you do have to be prepared for the consequences. So you could have negotiated everything just fine until that point, but no one negotiated being pulled over by the police because you couldn't plan for that.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to what we really haven't talked about here, and that is the legal definitions of consent and non-consent, because as far as the law is concerned, no means no whenever it is given. You can't come back later and say, oh, I was only joking, or we agreed that I would say no, but we weren't serious about it. But as far as the law is concerned, no means no. And this is where it gets really dangerous. Have you seen people get into this mess at all, Betty?
I mean, I've seen people get sued over this mess. I've seen people end up arrested over things like that because they decided no means no, and it got to the point where someone decided no really just means no. I don't, and it didn't matter what safe word they were using. Someone took it too far, and it ended up being the responsibility of the top. And in the legal aspect, the judge has decided you were in charge of the situation. This is your responsibility. So I would want someone to be upset with me that I ended a scene rather than not listen to no means no. Because you can always create a scene. You can't always get your life back. You can't always reverse damage that happens. And it's a showing of extreme trust and confidence in your partner when you do give consensual non-consent. And in the eyes of the law, rape is rape.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's the flip side of that coin. Even if you sign an agreement that says, all right, you can kidnap me off the street on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock and throw me in the back of a van and take me to a warehouse and torture me for the rest of the night, even if you have that written down on a piece of paper, that is a security blanket that has absolutely no teeth to it. Wouldn't you agree, Betty? I mean, it's an illegal contract because you cannot. One of the things that is a requirement for any contract is that it have a legal purpose, and kidnapping is illegal. So you can't have a contract that says you're authorized to kidnap me.
Exactly. No judge is going to say, oh, it's fine that you kidnapped this person because that's an illegal aspect. And even if it were signed, would it actually get notarized? Would it actually hold anything in court? Who would really go to the defense of that? You'd have to find someone who would defend in the BDSM community, and the eyes of the moral majority law would say that what you're doing is illegal. There are still states where sodomy is illegal, let alone kidnapping and consensual kidnapping.
And for our listeners, sodomy is one of those crazy laws that can mean pretty much anything a prosecutor wants it to mean. It is defined, seriously, it's defined in the law as an unnatural sex act. Period. And so whatever they decide that means, that's what it means, and people do go to jail for that. So have you seen where this sort of thing has gone horribly wrong for people, Lolly?
I haven't seen personally. I've definitely heard stories of situations where, the law gets involved, and even when they have video recordings of the victim, quote unquote, giving consent to exactly what was going on, they were still prosecuted. And I think a huge problem with this is that there are all these little laws that people don't really know about. Like, for example, in, I believe it's Jersey, if you are tied up, if you are engaged in any sort of bondage, you are officially no longer able to consent to anything. You have given up your legal right to consent. And, those kinds of things are a huge problem, legally-wise.
How about you, LB? Ever heard of these things going wrong for people?
I haven't, just being so new to the scene, but I was gonna mention before Lolly mentioned Jersey that a lot of this probably does depend on what state you're in, because states' laws vary so much. But my overall thought is that you really can't give someone permission to break the law. We just don't have that authority. So whether you consent to it and sign a document and have it notarized and have it blessed by a priest, it's not going to matter in the eyes of the law. Whether or not that's right or wrong is for other people to decide. But yeah, those are my two.
Now here's the other question I have for you, Betty. What stops someone from changing their mind after the fact? In other words, I give you consent to do something to me now, and years from now, just before the statute of limitations runs out, I say, you know what, I changed my mind. I did not. Who's going to have a way to defend themselves from that 6 years later?
No one. And no one has a crystal ball to say, oh, in 6 years I'm still going to be playing with this person and this person's going to be wonderful, and in 6 years anything can happen and people can change, and they may have been new in the scene when they went through this scene with someone, and now it's 6 years later and they've had a really long time to reflect on what they did, or someone clued them into what they did was actually very wrong or very dangerous. There's no protection anywhere, and then it's just a matter of, oh, he said, she said, or, oh, we had this piece of paper signed, but really a judge might say, well, were you under the influence of anything at the time? People can lie, and it really gets into a hairy situation where you have to really trust and believe that what you're doing is in the interest of both people. And when you're giving the consensual non-consent, you're playing with boundaries and you're playing with limits. It's always easier to stop something rather than continue it if you feel uncomfortable. And again, you can't plan for the future. There is nothing that's going to prevent you years down the line from someone instigating that you did something wrong. Nothing could have even happened, and someone could easily blame you for something.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This is a very touchy subject, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this after the next break. But what I'd like you to think about during the break, and when we get back we'll talk about it, is this question, and that is, in this environment, in the political environment today, where you're seeing a lot of activism about trying to reverse the so-called rape culture, is this bad news for the fetish community? Think about that, and we'll answer that question when we get back from the break. This is Mike Mackay. You're listening to Domination and Submission Radio. This is Mike Mackay. You're listening to Domination Submission Radio. Our guest is Betty, a sex educator from Washington, D.C. And my question for you, Betty, is does this activism that we're seeing more and more of these days to try and reverse the rape culture mindset, is this bad news for the BDSM culture?
Well, I think that everyone in general should support, safe, sane, and consensual play. And the laws don't protect you. You're not protected by anything. someone somewhere could easily blame you for rape outside of BDSM, let alone inside of BDSM. You could be traveling on the train and in the city, and someone could blame you for anything, really, and then you find yourself in a really dirty legal battle. That happens outside of BDSM all the time. So it's just a matter of always trying to play it as safe as possible for yourself and for your partners, and trying to change the rape culture in general. It has to change, like I said, in general. It's not just a BDSM thing. Rape can happen anywhere, not just within BDSM. And I think we get the finger pointed at us a lot because it is something that's more prevalent, and it is something that people do play with, that people do fantasize, that people do fetishize. And trying to say what rape is and what rape isn't, and when you have two consenting adults or two married adults, husbands can still rape wives, wives can still rape husbands, husbands can still rape husbands. So again, the laws don't really protect you, and it's just a bad scene in general when you feel that your personal rights have been violated or someone violates your rights, even if something didn't happen, because, again, you could be accused of anything.
Sure. We have a caller. This is Little Red calling from the Midwest. How are you doing, Red? You got a question for our guest tonight?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the non-consensual consent, where does the line get drawn for us? Because sometimes, not me personally, but I do know several that this is their fetish. So where do we draw the line at? Because, yes, you can come in and say, so-and-so did this. But if it was between consenting adults and somebody else finds out about it, is it still non-consent?
Well, I'll let Betty answer this. Betty?
I think if you are placing that trust in your partner for your fetish and your fantasy to be played out, that you are also trusting that you and that person in that scene are prepared to handle whatever backlash may occur. And when you enter these scenes, we don't always think about, that can or cannot happen down the road, because, again, we can't plan for the future. And so you're giving that other person consent for things to happen, and that they're in control, and they're going to be responsible for it more than likely, as well as you, because you're also there. And if someone else does find out about it, it comes down to, are they telling other people, and are they making it up? How does one even prove that the both of you did anything? And then it then becomes a moment of he said, she said. Because if you and your partner are consenting that this did happen in your own home behind closed doors, someone else finding out doesn't really matter as much, I don't think, because the both of you are agreeing. But if someone else finds out and suddenly there's a problem, you both agreed to enter this scene, and now someone else's life is going to be at stake because the game has been changed. And that's why a lot of it is generally frowned upon, because it is such a gray area, and the laws, again, don't protect you. And you could say, I trusted them implicitly at the time, and something could happen where you don't trust them anymore. So consent should be given at the time, not as a blanket in general forever.
Does that answer your question, Red?
For the most part, yeah. I'm into impact play, but he can be charged with battery without my consent, even though the impact play is completely consensual.
This is true.
Because the law doesn't protect, because it's mostly, they don't draw the line in between it. It's battery.
Absolutely true. And that's something that just about everybody needs to be aware of, is that most of us have watched TV shows where somebody refuses to press charges against somebody. Well, there's no such thing. This is a myth. The law can prosecute somebody whether you, quote unquote, press charges or not, because it's not you that presses the charges, it's the district attorney. And what it really boils down to is, will they have a case without your voluntary testimony? But even if you don't testify and there are 10 other people who says, yeah, he hit her with a stick, guess what? Somebody's going to jail. Because the question isn't whether you wanted to be hit or not. The question is, does the law allow somebody to hit somebody else with a stick? That's really what it boils down to. Thanks for calling in, Red. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Bye-bye. So, Lolly, what do you got to say on this?
I just have a little bit of advice. I mean, a lot of this conversation instills paranoia in people, particularly newer players and, people who have been kind of arguing over this a lot. And really the best advice that I think applies to this is kind of be careful what is evidence, if that makes sense. A lot of people get off exhibitionists. I am one. Hello, I'm a fetish model. I get pictures taken of me in very compromising positions all the time. Be careful how much you have on film. Be careful, what evidence you have out there, because if you don't have evidence, everything is hearsay and you're pretty much okay, assuming somebody doesn't bust into your apartment with a video camera and say, ha-ha, I got you. So, a lot of these arguments can really be boiled down to, is this actually a practical experience to be concerned about?
How about you, LB? Anything to say on this?
All I'm going to say is it seems like a lot of these things or potential problems could arise, whether you're in a consensual relationship or it's CNC or whatever. I mean, whether you're giving a consent or not. I mean, if I can give consent for my husband, who is my dominant in the bedroom, to paddle me, and if it leaves marks, then he could go to jail for domestic violence. But if I'm giving consent, it doesn't matter if I give consent ahead of time or give consent to have that consent taken away later. It can get very muddled.
Here's what I think. I think this all really boils down to trust, and it really hinges on whether you trust the people that you play with. In my worldview, in my perspective, this is a big endorsement of knowing who you're playing with. Plain and simple. It points out the real risks of playing with complete strangers. And it's one of the reasons why most community BDSM groups and munch groups and that sort of thing don't just invite people off the street to come play right off the bat. They like to know who you are and have at least had coffee with you a couple of times before they put a paddle or a flogger in your hand and invite you to a party, because this can be a real problem if it's someone you've never met before or really don't know, or they don't fully understand the rules or the implications or the consequences or any of that stuff. So you're right, LB. This all boils down to, who do you trust? If it's just you and your husband in the bedroom, guess what? There's nobody else that's going to testify. So if you don't testify against him, there's not a problem there. But if you're in a group of 50 people and you say, I'm not going to testify, he's my husband, but 49 other people say, yeah, he was beating her with a stick and boy, it was abusive and it was definitely battery, assault, or whatever, guess what? There's going to be a problem. And we can't always trust the court system to understand our perspective. I'm going to give you the last say on this. Betty, what do you say?
I agree with all of it. Again, if you're in your bedroom and you're not testifying against your husband or anything like that, you're giving your consent and you are trusting and you're giving up a lot of your trust. And that is part of what people fetishize about it, and that is part of what people enjoy about it. And that is a trusting relationship where I don't think you would marry someone that you didn't trust. But if you are new or you are playing with newer people, it is good to ask around, and it's called being vetted. And a few people have to say that you're an upstanding member of the community because they've seen you play and they've interacted with you and, on more than just a hi, how are you? They've sat with you. They've had these interactions. They may have played with you, and they can say that you're safe, sane, and consensual, that you're an upstanding person. And in those situations, it's a lot better to try to play with people like that, or even to do your homework before entering into a scene with someone you just really don't know. If you do want to err on the side of caution, which is always recommended, have people that can stop a scene for you, or have someone monitor your scene, or have a mentor that you can talk to about this stuff before you enter into anything, because ultimately you do have to also enter a scene. Scenes don't just spring up on the street usually, unless you're going on a date with someone who gets off on not telling you that they're married and suddenly you find out that they're a cuckold or something like that. But other than that, you don't generally just enter upon scenes. You do have some say in what happens.
In your work, Betty, do you find that the general public, people who are outside the BDSM lifestyle, have a complete misunderstanding of how these topics are viewed within the lifestyle? And have you run into this political correctness that says that BDSM is abuse in any venue, in any way, shape, or form? And I've seen it, so don't tell me it's not out there. Do you run into this, and how do you deal with it?
It's completely out there. We have people who don't feel comfortable talking about sex or BDSM, or they say, oh, those people, and there's always this harsh social judgment or harsh overtone that's attached to what the BDSM lifestyle is or does. And a lot of it is a miscommunication, and a lot of it in general is a miscommunication. And there's people out there that, want things the way they want things, and they're only into what they're into, and that what the BDSM community does is terrible. And then there's
different laws in different states that even dictate that, where you have morality laws, especially in Washington, D.C., where even education shops that are educational and trying to sell healthy, body-positive toys to people, their toys can't look very phallic. And so you have these moral laws that exist out there as well. So you have to kind of play by everyone else's rules, and then when you get to make your own rules in the bedroom, you're still playing by everyone else's rules because of what is considered legal and not legal, let alone what you're consenting and not consenting to. And how you deal with it is mostly you have to try to err on the side of caution and be very clear in what you want and what you're willing to accept for responsibility. And if you want to play that way, just understand that sometimes there are bigger laws out there that are frowned upon by people that just do not understand anything about BDSM, or they don't want to understand anything about BDSM.
Mm-hmm. We're at the end of our time. Let's just give LB a chance to plug her latest book, which is about to come out. LB, tell us about your book.
Oh, my book. Yeah, I'm going to be releasing my newest book next week. It's just a novella. It's very short, called Little Sinner, and it is a priest fetish novella, and that's probably all I'm going to say about it right now.
All right. Lolly, you got any projects you want to tell the folks about?
A couple secret projects that I can't disclose, but keep an eye out and follow me on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, whatever. Lolita Sin, 2 N's. You know the deal.
I know the deal. Betty, tell the folks how they can get in touch with you if they want to ask you any questions or become chums with you.
I can actually, if you want, I can send you an email address that we can plug right into your site. They can follow me on Twitter and things like that, and I can give you all of that information, and we can post it for your radio show if you like afterward, so that it's available to the people to direct email. That's no problem.
You can do that. We'll post that on the website and forward anything to you that comes up. Well, I appreciate you being our guest tonight, Betty. You've been a great guest, and I hope you'll be on the show more often.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thanks very much. We'll talk to you again. I'm going to take a moment to plug my book real quick. It's moving up in the charts. Started out at number 200,000, and it went up to number 30,000. The book is doing very well, getting rave reviews. If you want to find out a little bit more about the book, just visit domination-submission.com. And if you do get it, I appreciate a review. I'd like to hear what you thought of it. You've been listening to Domination Submission Radio, and we hope you'll be back next week for more BDSM Kink and Fetish Talk.